I would like you to vividly imagine the eggs that I described to you in the last lecture. See if you can really do it. See if you can almost close your eyes and imagine this omelet with mushrooms in it. See if you can imagine what it would look like, the colors you would see if that omelet was in front of you. See if you can imagine what it might smell like. Ignore what I'm doing right now. See if you can really imagine it. I'll join you. See if you can make it vivid enough that you can almost have a bodily reaction to it. I know if I've imagined these omelets well enough, my mouth will water, which is weird. I don't like mushrooms. See if you can do that. See if you can imagine this omelet vivid enough that you notice your mouth or your throat or your stomach start doing something. And ask yourself this question. If you can notice a physical reaction in your body, what is it exactly that your body is reacting to? As we had talked about before, if science was an organism, empiricism would be its spine. Empiricism is the backbone of any scientific enterprise. Empiricism, again, referring to the reliance on objective observation. And objective observation meaning observation irrespective of the personal tastes, beliefs, or opinions of the observer. In the development of the titanic scientific enterprises of chemistry or biology or physics, this version of empiricism worked quite well. But as we venture further into the labyrinth of science, when we get to the subject of psychology, this understanding of empiricism becomes more difficult. It's quite easy for many other scientific fields to point to exactly what their object of study is. They can just point and shoot. That is what we study. But for psychology, it's a bit different. Because what exactly do psychologists study and observe? Psychology runs into a unique challenge, what the behaviorists call the problem of private events. This dilemma can be summarized as follows. How can we make objective observations, irrespective of the personal opinions, tastes, or beliefs of the observer, when studying opinions, tastes, or beliefs themselves? In the introduction to the Handbook of Research Methods for Studying Daily Life, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, a doyen in this field, describes his quandary well. Quote, "To fail to understand the subjective experience of people means to miss what is most unique and perhaps most important about them." End quote. Our dilemma is how to objectively observe subjective experience. How does one go about studying with empiricism the mushrooms within our own heads? Scientific disciplines find their identities and therefore their methods by orienting to an object of orientation. For biology, that object of orientation is life, for example. And as that field becomes more specific and subfields emerge, the object of orientation becomes more narrowed. It's not just life, but it's the theory of evolution. Or it's not just life, but it's the cell or the gene. The fathers of psychology established this field of study of psychology, as the study of the psyche, and made its object of orientation the mind. What followed was an exploding field, finding all sorts of new ways to explain, describe, and make sense of subjective experience. This was by explaining private events, like the mushrooms you imagined in your head, with mental constructs or things. All of a sudden, in the eye of science, man had personality and imagination and working memory and cognitive load and resilience and intelligence, and of course, to host it all, a mind. It was the properties of these mental constructs that the psychological scientist endeavored to measure and accurately describe. The history of science had forever changed. There were now two worlds that a human being could inhabit. the world of physical structures and properties, and the world of mental structures and properties. And this neglected, mysterious, new, distant land of the mind would then be explored by the scientific pioneers of psychology. Now, like any good science, psychology started with the analytic aim of description and humbly tried to work itself upwards towards prediction and control. And if there's one thing that mainstream psychology does enormously well, it is describe. It does so, in my opinion, much better than behaviorism. It created a language of constructs running on rules of grammar and assumptions that fit neatly within colloquial speech. For example, in a complete English sentence, you cannot have just a predicate. You need a subject and predicate. There cannot just be an action, but there must be a thing to do the action within a sentence. So what do we do with all these loose mental actions? Psychology made itself a wide number of mental subjects to organize all these loose predications, stumbling and scattering around. And it sounds quite natural. Personality, or the mind, or intelligence can be comfortably discussed at the dinner table as it is discussed at the lab. This is hardly the case for behaviorism. If you find yourself discussing behaviorism at the dinner table, you're either at a conference or part of a really particular family. But before we get into why behaviorism talk is so hard, let's try and understand what mainstream psychology did, because somehow they dominated in this analytic aim of description. But how did psychology go about describing? One of the most important words you will learn in this lecture, probably if there is any one word that could have a life or death importance, is mentalism. Mentalism. Mentalism, mentalism, mentalism. Mentalism can be defined as the perspective that there is both a physical world and a mental inner dimension as well. It assumes that the phenomenon and constructs of this mental world are the causes, or at least the components, of all physical behavior that we can observe. Lastly, it believes all explanations of human behavior are incomplete without the use of mental constructs or phenomena to explain them. As a little heuristic, we can think about mentalism as I have mental, therefore I do physical. So here are some examples of mentalist thought. I have a mind, therefore I can think. I have an idea, therefore I act differently. To a mentalist, the causes of behaviors are emotions that I have, or abilities that I have, or understandings that I have, and so on. And by the way, it's not just that you have emotions, but that these emotions exist in this mental inner dimension that is separate from the kind of physical world. From the perspective of the behaviorist, only two consequences can follow this mental world assumption. The two consequences are hypothetical constructs and explanatory fictions. That sounds very complex, so let's go back to something simple. Remember when I told you to imagine those eggs? As you know, that was a thought. You have plenty of thoughts throughout the day. You remember those numbers people would say? You have 10,000 thoughts in a day, 50,000 thoughts in a day. I have no idea how they did that. I've never heard a scientist say that, so I don't really know how they measured that. But anyways, let's say you have that. You have 50 million quadrillion thoughts a day, right? And if you were meditative enough, maybe you could have observed every single one of them as you had them. And as you know, this is something that I have heard many academics talk about. The things that you think influence what you do and how you speak and treat others. So across time, these thoughts that we can observe, that we can experience, these thoughts might seem to hold certain properties. We begin to notice when you in particular speak aloud, it's different from when others in the class do the same. You stand out. Your thoughts seem to be unique. And so as a result, we must label this uniquenticity. we label you as smart, and descriptively, that works deliciously well to explain why you and your thoughts seem to be different than the rest of the class. But eventually, we want to better understand what smart means. How can we effectively measure smartness? How can we surely know if someone's smart? So we develop hypothetical constructs, like intelligence. Now, we've never observed an IQ wandering in the wild. We cannot measure or observe the properties of intelligence. But we can measure the properties of the private events, thoughts, or public behaviors, answers on a test, for example, and assume hypothetically that our construct of intelligence explains this phenomenon. Since these constructs are hypothetical, when they're used to explain behavior, we run into our second term, explanatory fictions. In attempting to explain cause with mental constructs, we deem an untouchable and unobservable mind or mental phenomenon as now holding responsibility for other tangible and really observable events. And by consequence, nothing is added to our explanation of how this happened in the physical world. It is scientific storytelling, and explanatory fiction is comparable to early humans adding descriptions of the water god to explain why the crops didn't grow and the harvest didn't come, or the rain didn't come and the harvest didn't grow, or whatever. You get the idea. So if we explain how the weather works and how the crops grow with the explanation of this water god, something deep in ourselves, some little itch is scratched. We get the comfort of some sort of description, but we also create a barrier for ourselves. The untouchable and unobservable, the water god, are also unpredictable and uncontrollable. In other words, once the harvest is due to some untouchable god, we will never understand how the tangible human being can make the crops grow. This is very arcane, so let's get something that's a little bit more concrete, that's understandable to the relevance of psychology. This descriptive error of using explanatory fictions lines up perfectly with how we normally talk about things. Skinner once said about behaviorism, "Every day in casual conversation, we tend to make nouns out of adjectives and verbs. We start by saying that the rope is strong. We can observe it. The rope is strong. And before long, we are speaking of its strength. We call it a particular kind of strength, tensile strength, and then now explain that the rope is strong because it possesses tensile strength." You see what we did there? Now, this is circular reasoning, which is a logical fallacy. But it isn't problematic when it comes to rope, because rope is a physical object that we can test and observe. We may say that the rope is strong because it possesses tensile strength, but if pressed further, we may disclose that it's actually the material of the rope, or its weave. Hence, the circle of reasoning is broken, as tensile strength is now a property of different physical materials. This becomes problematic, though, when the reasoning is circular, when the presence of a conceptual noun is only able to explain an adjective or verb because of the presence of the adjective or verb. So let's give a concrete example. I need my hat for this one. Doctor, why? So doctor, how do we know that this patient is schizophrenic? Well, sir, because this patient hears voices in their heads. But doctor, why is this patient hearing voices in their head? Well, because, sir, it's obvious. She's a schizophrenic. That's why. It is possible to add any psychiatric disorder in this bad syllogism. This is based on the example from Paul Maloney in his book, The Therapy Industry, 2013. Now, this would not be circular if the answer to the second question, why is this person hearing voices in their head? It would not be circular reasoning if their answer to that question was not, again, schizophrenia, but instead something in the biology or the blood or some physical thing that we can actually observe. Something like a virus or a genetic disease, but even schizophrenia, one of the most biological, genetically heritable mental health disorders in the DSM-5, is still unexplainable by its mechanism and its cause. This is different when we refer to physical diseases and conditions. We might say, why does this person show symptoms? And the person responds, well, because this person has COVID. How do we know that this person has COVID? Well, because they have No, it's not because they show symptoms. It's because we've measured antibodies in their nasal passages, like in their nose and their throat, depending on how you took the test, right? So this is how the circular reasoning is broken, is because we tested. How do we know that this person has COVID? Because they have antibodies. And if we wanted to be really mechanistic with it, we could say that, because we measured some viral strain in their blood. Or I don't know where the virus of COVID is exactly in the body, but you get the idea. I think it's in the throat. But this is not the case for many psychological constructs. In fact, in the introduction of the DSM-5, it says clearly that none of the diagnoses in the book can be used to explain the etiology of a condition or underlying cause of the condition. So we cannot say that a person's schizophrenia is caused by their schizophrenia. That's part of a larger debate on mental health disorders. But anyways. There's a scene in The Office where Michael Scott is trying to fire one of his workers, Toby, and he's begging his boss, who won't let him. And Michael says, is there no way we can get rid of him? And his boss says, not without cause, Michael. To which Michael responds, I have cause. It's because I hate him. In the same way that hating someone cannot be a cause for termination in the workplace, in science, to the behaviorists, to say that someone does not get out of bed because they have depression, or that someone disrupts class because they have oppositional defiant disorder, or that someone gets a score on a test because they have a certain IQ, or that someone can communicate because they have certain language acquisition devices, are all inadequate, incomplete explanations of cause. While psychological constructs are great for saving time when trying to describe things, for example, like how do you even explain the condition of depression without using the word depression? If you were to merely explain the behaviors that they do every day, it would take forever. But at the same time, these same descriptive words are inadequate when trying to give causal explanations of behavior. So mainstream psychology started by looking at the analytic aim of description. And if description was ever a problem, the psychology of today has absolutely solved it. But in doing so, they created these mentalistic constructs that therefore created a new problem and created a ceiling or a barrier to be able to get to the third analytic aim. It created this barrier, which I'm going to call in this lecture, untouchable cause. If we attribute behavior to an untouchable mind, we cannot change it. So this now brings us to behavioral psychology, which aims to offer an adequate path to a science of cause, where the object of orientation is no longer the mind, but instead is the behavior. So as mentalist psychologists went inwards trying to study, what did I write here specifically? As mentalist psychologists went inwards and looked at the relations between mental events to derive constructs and things, the behavioral psychologists went outwards to look at the relations between physical events to derive principles and patterns. To the behavioral psychologists, the dual world of the mental and physical collapse into one. The mental is the physical to the behaviorist. The physical is behavior in response to and shaped by the environment. Now, for the behaviorist, there's no extrapolation about a mind or a cognitive system that causes things in the background. If such ghosts in the machine exist, the behaviorist is not interested. Even further, the behaviorist is not even perturbed or intimidated. If such phantoms exist, they're too ethereal, they can live rent-free if they want. Instead, the behaviorist believes that what truly shapes the presence of any behavior has to do with other relevant physical events, either now or in the past. And so, across time, the marry two between the organism and the environment create a behavioral history, and in such a history is where most behavior, the behaviorist argues, can be explained. Now, there are different strata of behaviorism, different tribes or clans, each of which have their own interpretation of how to create a psychology of behavior and address the mental constructs problem. So in this lecture, I'll be going over briefly two of these attempts. So the first attempt at behaviorism is where it all started. The famous, infamous, depending on how you look at it. But to be able to understand this first attempt at behaviorism, you have to know a name. The name is John B. Watson, famously known as the father of behaviorism and the founder of methodological behaviorism. Watson set the standard for many behaviorist thinkers afterwards to vehemently attack any instance of mentalism. Instead, the way Watson argued psychology could be an objective science and deal with the problem of private events is to assume that they can be adequately ignored. Watson thought if there were thoughts and feelings and a whole bunch of middle aspects in the mind between a behavior and something in their environment, and then a behavior and then something in the environment, we can just look at the behavior and environment and ignore the middleman. Cut out the supply chain. Right? So methodological behaviorists looked at behaviors and physical events only that can be observed publicly. This means could be observed by not just one person, but by Watson and his group of buddies, right? And then hence only the data to be considered is in relation to the physical environment. The methodological behaviorists do not care what you thought. They do not care what you felt. Instead, what did you physically do? What did you respond to? And only considering the things that a crowd or a group of people can publicly observe. They argued for a stimulus-response kind of psychology and said that any mental middleman can be adequately ignored. So Watson famously said, or infamously said, this is a very cited quote from Watson. He said, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, in my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant, chief, and yes, even beggar man and thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors. I'm going beyond my facts, and I admit it, but so have the advocates of the contrary, and they have been doing it for many thousands of years." This quote has been used countless times to discredit Watson and behaviorism as a whole, as he was speaking much beyond his data at the time and the science that we have right now. Still, Watson was a very powerful foundation from which newer forms of behaviorism can stand on. From my current understanding, though, there are not many, if any, methodological behaviorists left. Now, to understand this second form of behaviorism discussed here, you must know a second name. The founder of radical behaviorism, B.F. Skinner. And he's the founder of the radical behaviorism philosophy of science. Now, radical behaviorism is not for the crazy behaviorists. It's a poor choice of words, in my opinion, but radical in this way is not supposed to mean crazy. It's supposed to mean thorough, through and through. So radical behaviorists thought that it was all behavior, including thoughts and feelings too. And this was their solution to the problem of private events. This form of behaviorism has two major implications that are very radically different from, this is radical in a very extreme way, but very, very starkly different from many other perspectives in psychology. the first implication of this perspective, if it's all behavior, that means it implicates to the behavior of the scientists themselves. So not only is the subject of the observation of the behaviorist behavior, but also what the scientist is doing, the observations that the scientist is making themselves, must be explained by the same principles that apply to whatever the scientist is observing. So this means, if we take the implications of what behaviorism had already established, it means that science is not an intellectual enterprise. It's a social one. That the products of science are not truth, but instead celebrated social explanations that we label as truth. And so science becomes a social system of discovery and discourse where adequate verbal behavior, labeled as explanations or theories, are reinforced for their thoroughness and utility. As a consequence, gravity is no longer the force that pulls bodies down, but instead is the label that human organisms use to explain the phenomenon of why bodies fall. And people use this theory of gravity not because it is true, behaviorally that doesn't make sense, but because it works in a way that's reinforcing for scientists. And how we describe that process is by saying gravity is true. In this way, scientists are not objective observers of the truth of reality, but instead, scientists are keen observers of the events in the world that can be described in a way that academics socially reinforce. Okay. The second implication of this thorough radical behaviorism is that, yes, those mushrooms are real. Mushrooms that were in your head, they're real. And yes, unlike Watson, they're acknowledging that you can objectively observe them, even though you are the only one that can observe them. It doesn't mean that these events aren't objective. It just means that they're private. So when you observe those eggs in your head, picture those eggs. See if you can really do it. Turn all the creative juices to fucking fry that egg. Put it right in front of you. Scramble it. Put it in an omelet. Whatever it is. When you look at that egg, can you be absolutely sure that it isn't a polar bear? If so, then we have reason to believe that it's not up to you, that you can't take that and make it whatever you want, that was, if you were being honest with yourself, objectively, mushrooms and eggs. I lost my place, there I found it, But this private world does not mean that it's mental. To the radical behaviorists, they do not think thoughts and feelings are mental things. There's no mind-body connection or even a mind at all to these behaviorists. What happens in the head is simply happening in the body. You have a nervous system. It's part of the body. It's not just your head, but it includes your head. And so your thoughts or feelings are not a result of mental things that you have in your own mind, but simply a result of an organism feeling its own body. Yes, those mushrooms are real, but not as mental mushrooms or mushrooms from a mind, but simply as a physiological response. Now, some people don't like the idea that something can be objective but only observed by one person. They think that isn't objective, right? How can we verify? How can we know that it's true if only one person is observing it? But the radical behaviorists still believe that you can objectively observe it, even if it's just one person. So it can be thought of like this. Even if Galileo was the only observer of the planets and the stars and the only person who observed at that time that the Earth was revolving around the sun. No one else was observing it. No one else believed it. No one else was seeing it. It was just Galileo. If that were the case, the behaviorists would still make the argument that Galileo is making an objective observation, even if it's just Galileo making that observation. He is still doing science. It's just very, very limited science, because if science is a social enterprise and it's only one, it's very, very limited. So by taking this as the solution to the problem of private events, by only looking to events and not mental constructs to explain them, this was Skinner's brave attempt to create a science of adequate prediction and control. When you really get into it, I do believe Skinner's solution to this problem of private events was quite an eloquent one, with revolutionary applications in domains of human behavior like developmental disabilities, behavioral issues, and even very serious clinical disorders. But at the same time, Skinner's solution was unique to a terrible degree, and by side effect, created a philosophy of science that is not welcome to the lay person's dinner table. To many budding scientists of behavioral analysis, budding students, you could say scientists too, of behavior analysis, radical behaviorism can feel difficult to grasp, and at times like trying to firmly grip wet soap, incredibly elusive. And so while Skinner produced a radically pragmatic solution to the problem of cause, he created a new problem for many behavioral students to now face: the problem of arcane description. And so this is what we aim to tackle in our last lecture, what is controversially, I imagine, called the behavioral intuition. Hope to see you there.